Well, good afternoon, everyone. I have 5:30 Central, 6:30 Eastern Time, and time to get started. I'd like to welcome everyone here to the next session of our Fall 2020 Tennessee Master Beef Producer Webinar Program. Really excited that you're able to join us again here this evening. Excited about the discussion. So I'll just go through a few things that I've done here with each of the webinars to open up, and then I'll introduce our speaker and we'll get started. So one thing I'd like to say that I've said, if you've been signed on for the others, is that we want to, first of all, really thank our partners in this. We put an emphasis on sustainability for this webinar session in our Tennessee Master Beef Producer Program. In so doing, we've been working with the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. If you're not aware of the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef or their work towards sustainability and giving you as a beef cattle producer a voice in the sustainability discussion and really trying to direct that in a way that's good for all those involved in the industry, I would encourage you to go to their website, look at that. They have a lot of more information than we've covered here so far that we will eventually get to, but on sustainability, they have some self-assessments to kind of see where you are. But I'd encourage you to just look at their website, get to know the work that they're doing, because I think you'll find it to be really something that you would value in the way that the Roundtable looks at sustainability, not just as environmental sustainability, that being a huge component of it, but also generational sustainability that we'll talk about in one of our webinars upcoming, and economic sustainability, communities, the whole thing. So really good work there, and we're proud to work with them. So Dr. Bates, actually, who's presenting tonight, is our liaison for the UT Institute of Agriculture with the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. And in the work that he's done in those meetings and with that group, he's made contacts with Golden State Foods and Nestle, and they're actually directly our sponsors, members of the roundtable that they're working with us to do this sustainability work. So specifically what we're doing is looking at the metrics that the U.S. Roundtable will use to measure sustainability and to measure improvements that we as an industry or that you as an individual can make in that move toward your sustainability as we define it in a lot of different ways. Another set of objectives that we have in this specifically as specialists for University of Tennessee Extension is, again, to give you a voice as Tennessee cattle producers in defining and setting goals for what we call sustainability as an industry, and then also to prepare you as a producer for if the market moves in a way that creates more demand for sustainably produced calves, that you'll be in a situation to take advantage of that market, those market changes very early on by having this information, able to do these self-assessments and verify that you would produce cattle in a sustainable way. So again, we're excited to be on the front end of this discussion for a lot of different reasons, and hopefully you'll take a look more at the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef website to understand more of that. A couple of things as we go through the webinar this evening. If you're viewing from the desktop application, I think maybe also from the smartphone apps, that we'll have some questions that pop up throughout the webinars, a couple at the beginning and a few at the end, that you'll be able to answer directly on the screen. I'll remind you that if you're viewing in a web browser, that you won't actually see these questions, but Courtney Carter, who's one of the other moderators here this evening, she'll be sending you a link to a survey where you can complete these questions, kind of give us an idea of, at least with the people that are signed on for the webinar today, where we are on some of these metrics. Now, what you see on the screen here is just an example. That's not a live question, so you won't be able to answer it, but just wanted to let you know what those questions will look like. And again, Courtney will be on to show you those, talk you through those, and help you, or at least read the questions to you and show you where to answer those. Also, since this is a webinar platform, we don't have, if you're viewing this, we don't see your video. We won't have audio for you, so we can't communicate directly because we have a large number of folks signing on to these each time we do it. So with the webinar platform, instead of having a discussion back and forth, the opportunity that you'll have to ask questions will be in the Q&A. So you'll see a couple little quote boxes that with Q&A. If you'll click that, it'll open up a box where you can type a question in. And as Dr. Bates goes through his presentation this evening, I'll be watching those. I've tried to answer some of those in past webinars. I have a feeling tonight there won't be a lot that I can answer directly, but I'll kind of assemble those. I've been calling it curate those in a way that I can ask Dr. Bates those questions at the end in a way that he'll be able to address a lot of them at once. Now, what I found is in sticking to a reasonable time frame to respect your time this evening, we probably won't get to all those questions, but please just feel free to type those in. We'll get to as many as we can, and we are always here, and your county agent always here to help you with those questions if we can't get to them tonight. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening. I was trying to think of what I would say about Gary. And whenever you have the opportunity to introduce a friend giving a talk, you can really say about anything you want to, but I'm going to be serious here tonight. So like I said, Gary is a good friend of mine, a mentor, as I've gotten, last 10 years under my belt here as a specialist at UT. Just watching him operate, I've learned a lot, and just really admire and respect what he does as a specialist. So I'm excited that he's going to be giving us a presentation tonight here on rotational grazing. Now, we give each other a hard time, and you'll probably see that happen during the Q&A and maybe even some during the presentation, just to keep him on his toes. But with that, Gary, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, Justin, thank you very much. And I am really excited about the opportunity to be able to cover this topic and talk about it, because like Justin mentioned, okay, so the University of Tennessee, our Institute of Agriculture, is a member of the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and I have gone to a lot of those meetings, and we've gone through and talked about the various things for sustainability. And a lot of times people view, sustainability kind of as this negative word, and maybe when I first started going to those meetings, I was a little bit kind of backing off, trying to figure out, okay, what exactly is this organization trying to do? And what I very quickly realized is this group really has the entire beef industry in mind. It's actually made up of the people from the entire segment, everything from cow-calf producers all the way to the retail industry. And the whole idea of this is to try to make sure that we maintain a viable beef industry in the U.S. And so as we were starting to meet with them, everything, what I recognized is some of the educational programs that we have here at the University of Tennessee really address these issues. And so we got, together our beef group and started talking about how can we be involved with them with, our educational programs. And so this webinar series has kind of been part of it. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can get started. Okay, so Justin, can you see that?
Yes, go ahead. Yep, you're perfect.
Okay, fantastic. So the thing that we want to talk a little bit about tonight is grazing management. And the reason that we, decided to cover this is because this provides a very simple tool that solves a lot of issues that you have on the farm, both production issues and challenges that you face, as well as, some of the potential the sustainability issues. So I just pull out this data that I found. It's something that I got from, the USDA from the pasture monitoring they do. They kind of monitor pastures over the, the course of the year from various places in the U.S. And, there's a lot of lines on here, so we don't want to get too hung up on individual lines. But basically what you'll see is the ratings of pastures in the U.S. as you go from April, that springtime through the summer and kind of into the fall. Every year, pastures get in worse conditions. They start out really good and then they tend to drop. Some years, maybe the drop, is not too terribly bad. We can have some years where we get rainfall during the summer and, everything's not too bad. But then you can have some of the years where the pastures just become in horrible shape. And all of us have experienced some of those, say over the last decade or so. And a lot of the reason why we have this drop in the condition of our pastures, it's because of weather, high temperatures, maybe a drought, a lack of rainfall causes a drop. But sometimes it's also, it's caused to be worse due to our management. And so that's kind of the thing that we want to talk about tonight. And a lot of times it's due to our grazing management. And so I just started going through and think about what are some of the impacts if we overgraze our pastures. And so I just listed a few here. You know, one of them is going to be the reduced yield. If you overgraze your pastures, they're not going to grow as well. And so obviously your yield is going to be produced. But then following right after that, if you overgraze those pastures and they're not growing as well, you're going to thin some of your stands out. You're going to have a decrease in persistence. You know, and it may not be the fact that you kill, you know, every bit of the, you know, of the stand, that all the plants are dead. It may be that you lose 20 or 30 or 50% of your plants. So you end up with these weak stands. So then when you have weaker stands and they're not full of grass, what's going to come in? It's going to be weeds. So we end up with all these weed issues. And, you know, we can think about all the different weeds, everything from, you know, buttercup in the spring to, you know, horse nettle and spiny pigweed during the summertime, but all these weed issues that we have. Some of that is due to our grazing management. Then you follow right behind that, we have soil erosion issues. You know, you have open soil, rain's hitting it. You know, maybe that rain is not getting into the soil, it's running off, so it's carrying some soil with it. And we have soil erosion issues. So there's this land problem that we have. We you know, without that good stand of grass, we're not capturing all of the water that we should. It's running off into the creek instead of getting into the soil. So we have those kind of issues. And then there's some of these other environmental issues that, you know, really have just kind of become kind of pointed out over these last few years. Everybody has heard about the concerns that people have with, you know, greenhouse gases, with livestock production. And I'm not here to try to, you know, argue yes or no whether, you know, cattle are the biggest, you know, contributor to that. I think we all know it tends to be the energy industry and transportation and all those, but we can't ignore the fact that cattle do contribute some of the greenhouse gases. Well, if we could do a good job with our grazing management, we're going to be keeping a good stand of grass. We're going to be capturing a lot of carbon dioxide just due to photosynthesis. And some of that carbon dioxide is going to be put into the ground in the form of carbon and root growth and that kind of thing. And so a good grazing management plan is going to be able to help us, you know, be able to minimize some of those issues. On the opposite side, if we overgraze and don't have a good grazing management plan, we're going to contribute a little bit more to those problems. So overgrazing causes us huge amounts of problems. So what I want to try to do tonight is to try to go through some of the reasons why you really should consider your grazing management plan. And when I talk about grazing management, I'm not talking, excuse me, just simply about building fences and rotating cattle, okay? That's part of it, but that's not the only part of it that we're talking about. So if we have a good grazing management plan, we're going to get increased yield of our forage. Okay, and I'll show you some data that specifically addresses that. We're going to end up with better persistence of our pastures. So instead of having these thin stands that every 3 to 5 to 7 years we have to go in and renovate and try to drill more grass into, we can maintain a better stand. We're going to end up with less weed pressure. So now all of a sudden, okay, we're not going to be having to spray, you know, 2,4-D or Graze On Next or some of these herbicides every year. Maybe we can decrease some of that. And then we're also, if we're going to be getting better yield, we're going to get better animal production, more animal production from our land, which is going to end up, there's going to be a economic benefit to that. And then if we can keep a better stand of grass, and particularly tall fescue, so that we can graze more in that fall, we're going to have to feed, you know, hay less. And so if you go through and you think about it and you get more animal production, you're getting better yields, you're going to end up to be able to make more money. And then if you don't have to seed as often, you don't have to use as much herbicide to try to control weeds, and you're going to have to feed less hay, then you're actually saving money. So you're getting kind of a lot of benefit from a single management type of system. So this is the time that we have for our first question. And I think Courtney's going to take over here, right?
Yeah, just for a second. Let me get it pulled up.
Okay.
Okay. You should see question 1 now, and you can submit your answer. The question is, do you have a current grazing management plan? Excuse me. Do you have a current grazing management plan? Just simple yes or no. I'll give it about 30 seconds. There's still a little bit coming in, Dr. Bates.
Okay. I'm just amazed at technology, Courtney.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to share results with you. As soon as I get that chat out of the way. Here you go.
Okay, so we have 64% say they have a grazing management plan. 36% say no, they don't. And, you know, I don't think we specifically mean that to be a trick question, but what I would say to that is everybody on this webinar that has cattle has some type of a grazing management plan. Okay, now it may not be, you know, a real detailed one, but you have some plan that you utilize for your grazing. Now it may be you have one big pasture and all the cattle are in there and they just graze, and when they run out of forage, you start feeding hay. That might be your grazing management plan, but you have some type of a plan. So the thing that we want to try to talk about from this point forward are what are some things that you can do to try to improve on the current grazing management plan that you have. And everything revolves around this curve right here. And I have used this chart right here, you know, hundreds of times across the state, but everything that we're going to talk about in some form or fashion kind of revolves around this curve. And so what this curve right here illustrates is the growth rate of plants at different stages of maturity. Okay, and so what ends up happening is, you know, if I have this little plant right here, okay, that's just been grazed off, what's going to happen is that plant, you know, usually what a plant's trying to do is capture sunlight from photosynthesis, and then it's trying to use that energy that it captures to make carbohydrates that it uses to be able to grow. And so it uses that energy, grows leaves, it can photosynthesize more, and the process continues. Well, when I graze a plant off and I take the leaf area off, that plant can't photosynthesize enough to produce all the energy that it needs. So it pulls some of the stored energy that it has in the roots and kind of the crown of that plant to be able to grow. So if you look at the line, this line is illustrating the growth rate at these various stages. So the growth rate is relatively slow at that point. And the reason is because it takes time to get that energy out of the roots and get the, you know, the form of it changed and get it to the growing point. But it begins to grow, it starts to put leaves out, and then I get to a point where it's fully leafed out, it's capturing a huge amount of sunlight, it's photosynthesizing extremely fast, and so the growth rate is extremely fast at that point. And then if I continue to just let the plant grow and I don't graze it, I don't cut it, eventually what I end up with is this plant that's, you know, got bigger leaves, it's got more leaves than it has had at any point in its life. But the problem is that those leaves have gotten older, so they're less efficient at that photosynthetic process, so they're producing less energy. But then the other thing I have is I've got this seed head. So this plant has gone from a vegetative form of growth where it's trying to grow leaves to a reproductive form of growth where it's trying to produce seed. And so the plant's producing less energy at this point because the leaves are older, but then the energy it is producing is going into those seed to try to fill that seed, not trying to grow leaves, so my growth rate slows down. And so the thing, if you can understand what's going on with a plant and you can understand this growth curve, it really helps you be able to look at the plant, figure out kind of where it is on this curve, and it lets you kind of understand how you need to manage it. So if I go out in the springtime and I've got a field of fescue, and, you know, it's got a bunch of seed heads in there, it's, you know, 2.5 foot tall, what I need to think about is this plant's not trying to grow leaves anymore. It's trying to produce seed. So I need to harvest this forage somehow. I need to, cut it for hay, put a bunch of cattle on there, graze it down, something that's going to take that forage off, let sunlight get down there to the base of that plant and stimulate new tillers so that it can start this process over again. On the under end of this curve, if I graze it, okay, and that plant starts trying to grow and it's moving up this curve, but I've got so many cattle on this pasture that they come back and they graze it again and send it to the bottom of the curve. It's got to pull more energy out of the roots and it starts to regrow again. Cattle graze it down again, put it back down to the bottom of the curve, and that plant keeps trying to regrow. But before it can fully leaf back out and begin to capture sunlight, if cattle keep grazing it, I'm stressing my energy reserves for that plant. And eventually that plant's going to get to a point where it just doesn't have enough energy to regrow. And that's where I kill these plants. And then a lot of times this ends up happening during the summertime when it's dry. So I've got drought stress on top of it. And that's where I lose my stands. So what we need to think about in terms of our grazing management program, when I'm grazing my forages, okay, I need to make sure that I'm not spending too much time on either end of this curve. What I'm trying to do is to graze my forage down, but before I graze it down too low, I get cattle off of it, I'll let it regrow. Let it fully leaf back out so it can grow extremely fast, replace some of that energy that it used in that initial regrowth. And then before it tops this curve and gets really old and low quality and kind of stemmy, put cattle back on there, graze it back down, and move kind of back and forth on this curve between those two ends. But try to maintain it as best I can in that steepest part of the curve, because that's where you're going to get the best yield, because that's when the plant is at the steepest growth, that steepest growth rate, or got that steepest growth curve. And that's really the goal that we have in terms of the way that we want to try to graze. So let's talk about, let me just try to show you some data, some scientific data that shows you the impact, excuse me, that this can have. So one of the things that we did a couple of years ago, I had a grad student that was interested in this. So we went out to one of our farms, our East Tennessee Research and Education Center farms. We had an area of tall fescue, and we did two different treatments. We were trying to simulate either continuous grazing or rotational grazing. So for the continuous grazing, what he did was every week he clipped the forage down to 3 inches. Okay, he did that every week for 2 months. In the rotational grazing, he clipped it down to the same height, but he only did it once a month. He did it every 4 weeks, basically, is about what he did it. So the only difference between these two treatments was how often they were clipped. Everything was the same in terms of the plant species that were there, what was done in terms of fertilization, how low it was clipped. The only difference was the frequency of the clipping. And so what I'm going to try to show you here is the amount of yield that was harvested. Okay, so the green bar is what he harvested from the rotational system. The first harvest, got somewhere about 2,800 pounds of forage. He came back, what we labeled as week 5, clipped it again, got a little bit over 2 tons, came back week 9 and got slightly under a ton. Okay, 2,000 and slightly under 2,000 pounds here. So the total yield that he got was 6,700 pounds per acre. Okay, so that's 3 tons, slightly over 3 tons. That's a pretty good yield. When we compare that to the continuous, okay, the first harvest was the same because that's when we initially started it. He came back 1 week later, and you can see what he harvested. And you can see that really there was not significant regrowth because they were consistently, doing it every week. Didn't have a chance for those plants to regrow. So in that system, there was only 2 tons, 4,000 pounds that was harvested. So the difference between clipping every week versus every 4 weeks resulted in over a ton of extra forage using this rotational system. So that's actually, you get that more yield because you're keeping those plants, you're allowing those plants to be in that steepest part of the curve. So here's data that illustrates it. Now, I have one of my counterparts in Kentucky. I'm going to try to show a little bit of a video that can show you an individual plant and what happens. So they did something kind of similar. Now, they took orchard grass plants, well established in pots, okay, and they had two different pots here. One of them, they clipped it at 1 inch every week for 4 weeks. So for 1 month solid, every week they came back and they clipped it at 1 inch. They had another plant that they clipped it just once a month. So at the beginning and then at the end, they clipped it to 3.5 inches. So there was a slight difference in the clipping height. But what they did then is at that last clipping, they left the plant side by side and they took pictures like every so often, and they put it together in a video. And what I'm going to show you in this video is 5 days of regrowth after the last clipping. So let's see if we can make this work. Okay, and you can see the difference in how well these orchard grass plants regrow after these two different clipping scenarios. So just watch the growth here. And it's amazing how much faster this orchard grass plant on the right is regrowing, because it has not been stressed nearly to the level that that plant on the left was, because this plant on the left, not only was it cut slightly lower, but it's really that frequency of cutting that causes a problem. So look at the difference in regrowth in just 5 days. And think about this if you had this over an entire pasture, and the impact that this would have on the yield that you're going to get from this situation. So I guess the point that I want to make sure that you get out of this section right here is understanding that you have a dramatic impact on the yield that you're going to get from your pasture. And if you can let those plants regrow, leaf back out, capture more sunlight, then you're going to end up getting more yield than if you graze them down and keep them grazed down, so you stress those root reserves. So it has a pretty big impact on your yield. The second thing that it's going to have a pretty big impact on is going to be the persistence of your plants. And so there's been lots of work that shows how different grazing methods or clipping heights can influence the persistence, particularly of our cool season plants, something like tall fescue. I'm just going to try to show you some data about the impact on the roots. Now, there's a lot of data here. Don't get hung up on the individual numbers, okay? Because really what I'm going to want you looking for is the difference between the positives and the negatives. But here is what the person that did this study wanted to look at. They wanted to look at what the difference in different intensities of continuous grazing would have on root growth. And so they took Kentucky bluegrass plants in pots. Okay, they let all the pots grow up until they were, they had seed heads on them, and they put different levels of forage removal on them. So they did everything from here at the bottom. They didn't clip it at all, or they removed either 10 or 20, all the way up to 90% of the forage. So they clipped it down to different heights. And then what they did is, after that first clipping, every 3 days they came back and clipped it at that same height again. And then on these different days here, day 3, 7, 14, 21, and on, what they did is they measured root growth. And so what I want you to notice is, when you see a negative number, what that tells you is that is the percent of the roots that plant had that produced no growth during that period of time. So at day 3, if we look like, say, for instance, right here, 90% removal at day 3, 100% of the roots produced no growth. None of the roots were growing. When you see a positive number, like you see these down here, what that's telling you is that is the percent of new root growth that you got. So if you see 30%, you had 30% more root growth that occurred over that 3 period. And the thing that I have here is I have a line drawn at this 50% mark. Okay, and you'll notice that is where your numbers change from being negative to being positive. And so what this is telling you, if anybody's heard the kind of statement that when you're grazing, you want to take half, leave half. this is kind of data that kind of supports that. If you take, consistently, if you're grazing and you remove more than 50% of your forage, then you're shutting down some of your root growth. Whereas if you can leave, more than 50% of the forage out there, you're actually getting positive root growth. Anytime that you can get more root growth, you're enabling that plant to be able to take up more water. So that plant is going to better be able to survive drought. It's going to better be able to grow, and you're going to end up with a more persistent forage. And here's the thing that I want you to think about, okay? And because thing that really hits me is, let's look at that 70% number. If we were talking about a tall fescue pasture, okay, and we were at kind of a 70% removal kind of level, that would mean that we're leaving about 5 to 6 inches of forage out there. Okay, and most of us, if we would go to a pasture, okay, in April, maybe early May, and we saw fescue that was, 6 inches tall, we would look at a pasture and go, that's a pretty well managed pasture. But what I want you to notice, okay, is that if you keep it grazed at that 6-inch level for 3 weeks, 21 days, after 3 weeks, you have completely shut your root growth down. You have no root growth going on. And so that is going to limit that plant's ability going forward to be able to take up moisture. And so the thing that I want you to really take from this data is that your grazing management, not only is it affecting your above ground growth in terms of your yield and everything, it's also affecting what's happening below ground. So actually the best way to be able to manage a pasture, if you think back about this curve that we talked about a few minutes ago and think about this data, is actually graze the plant. Now, it's going to shock the root system a little bit, okay? You're going to kind of reduce some of your root growth, but then get off of it, let that plant regrow so that it can begin to grow top growth, but it can also, those roots can begin to grow again. And then after it regrows, come back and graze it again. Because a lot of times, if we have a drought, most of the time, people think about changing their grazing management when they're about 3 or 4 weeks into the drought. What this data shows me is that you should not wait until the drought to think about your root growth and trying to get plants to survive drought. How you graze in April impacts how well your plants are going to survive drought during July and August. So you got to pay attention to your grazing management, not just during the summertime, but you really need to pay attention to it during that springtime when we normally have just quite abundant growth. So that's kind of how your grazing management is going to impact your yield as well as your persistence and root growth. It also can have pretty big impact on the animal performance. So I'll show you a little bit of data on this. This right here was a study that was done in Louisiana where they were using ryegrass. And in this case, they were using stocker steers. Okay, and so they had 2 systems with annual ryegrass. They were using either a continuous system, just a large group of animals on a large pasture, or they were using kind of controlled grazing or rotational grazing where they had these paddocks that were sized so that animals were put on there and they grazed a paddock down in 2 days, then they were moved to a new paddock. And that was their rotation every 2 days. And so after they got through with the study, what they realized is that even under the as good a management as they could get, they could only carry about 1.2 steers per acre on the continuous grazing one. Whereas on the controlled grazing one, since the animals were grazing all of the forage and then moved to a new one and it was allowed to regrow, they could carry 2.2 steers per acre. So that's a pretty significant increase in the stocking rate that they could carry just strictly due to their grazing management. Now, if you look at this daily gain right here, what you'll notice is that the animals on the control grazing did not gain quite as much per day as their counterpart, an individual animal on the continuous grazing. So it dropped a little bit, and the reason for that is because the animals on the control grazing could not be selective. They were forced to graze everything in there, even some of the stems toward the lower part of that canopy, which is not quite as good a quality. They didn't gain quite as well, but when you look at the pasture gain, the gain per acre that they got, it was much higher on the controlled grazing. And so for most of us, the limiting resource that you have is actually your land. So what you need to do is get as much gain per acre as you can. The control grazing and the rotational grazing help them in this situation because they could capture all of that growth and get more yield through this rotational grazing. And so obviously they were able to gain more weight per acre. There's another study, this data right here. Now this one was done in Georgia by Dr. Carl Hovland, and this was with cow-calf pairs. And so it was with kind of fescue Bermuda grass mixes, a very similar type of study arrangement where they use continuous grazing or control grazing. And the control grazing, again, they rotated the animals every 2 days. So after they got through with the study, what they realized is they could only carry they needed 2 acres per cow-calf pair under the continuous grazing. That's how many acres it took per pair, whereas under the control grazing, it only took 1.5 acres. So they could actually carry more animals on the control grazing because it didn't take as much land per pair. If you look through this data, the pregnancy rate was the same, weaning weight was exactly the same, but because they could carry more animals on the control grazing treatment, they got more gain per acre. So the thing that I want you to make sure you understand from this is, anytime you can get better yield and you graze it so you capture more of that forage, you're able to harvest more of that forage, you're going to get more gain per acre. And that has a significant economic, impact on what you're trying to do from a cow-calf operation. That's what we're trying to sell. We're trying to sell, weight. So the thing about it is, where do you start? Okay, because I know everybody out here, you're watching this, you've got cattle, you have some level of a grazing management plan, but it might be, where you have really large pastures and, you just leave them out there for, a month or 2 months or something like that at a time. I'm not saying through this presentation that all of a sudden now you're going to go, to your local, feed and seed dealer and buy thousands and thousands of dollars of fencing, okay, and split every pasture you have into these little, 2-acre paddocks. We're not saying we need to do that, but you do at least need to start somewhere and start dividing some of your pastures so it gives you the opportunity to rotate into a pasture and rest a pasture. That's really what you're needing to do, is to give a pasture, give some of these grass plants a chance to be able to rest and regrow so they can produce these leaves, they can get that root growth, so you'll end up getting that better yield. Now, an example that, I've used before is something simple like this, okay? Because a lot of people, if you read magazines about rotational grazing, or you go to somebody's farm, and a lot of people want to make this really complicated. You can make it really complicated, but it doesn't have to be. So if you find yourself in a situation where you got a big pasture, you got a water source, it's a pond or a tank or whatever it may end up being, it may be just as simple as drawing a simple, temporary fence right across the middle of the thing. Use the same exact water sources you have. And if you do nothing but this right here, what it's giving you the opportunity to do is to graze your cattle on half the pasture while the other half rests. And then at some point, you move the cattle to the other side, and then that top side rests. You could be a lot more efficient than this, but at least this gives you some level of ability to rest pastures and for them to not get grazed, so you can minimize some of the overgrazing. Once you go to that level, it may be just as simple as taking that same water source now and putting another couple of fences up. You're not having to, necessarily dig water lines and put, new water troughs all over the place. You can just use your existing water source as it is. And if you do a system like this, now all of a sudden you've got a system where you can graze. The animals are going to graze all of that forage in there because they don't have as much selectivity, because they don't have as much area to graze, so they're going to graze every bit of it. And when they graze this top area down, you move them to the next one, and you just kind of keep rotating through there. So you've not really, changed anything in terms of specifically the number of cattle you have or the area that you graze in, but you're going to end up capturing and harvesting more of the forage that you're growing. I give you a good example of a situation. Back a lot of years ago, we used to have something over in West Tennessee that we called it West Tennessee Hay Day. And we would always, do it on a producer farm. And the farm we were doing it on, we would have different kind of educational programs we do in the morning. And then what we would do is eat lunch. And in the afternoon, a lot of the local tractor dealers would come in and bring tractors and hay mowers and rakes and tedders and balers and everything. And we would let them show off their equipment and let producers learn about the newest haymaking equipment that was out there. Well, one year there was a farm we went to. We wanted to do a little demonstration about rotational grazing. So there was I'm going to say it was about a 22, maybe a 25 acre field that we used, and we had come up in there earlier in the season, and we had divided it into 5 different smaller paddocks. And, the producer grazed those during the whole season. And what ended up happening is during that springtime, he would go from, paddock 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. And every time he got through grazing paddock number 4, normally he would have moved them into paddock number 5, but paddock number 1 was ready to grow again. So he'd always move them back to paddock 1. And that whole spring, he never had to graze that paddock number 5. And the reason that I remember that was because when it came time to run the hay equipment, the place where we ran the hay equipment was in that paddock number 5 because it was the closest to where all the tents and everything were. And I remember talking to that producer after it's over with, and one of the comments that he said was that he had been grazing his cattle on that pasture every spring for years. And this was the first year that he had ever realized, or that he had ever had a chance to be able to get any hay cut off of that. And he recognized that for years he had been wasted about 20% of his forage because one of those paddocks he was able to cut hay off of that year. That's the type of thing that you're going to be able to see with a rotational grazing program. You're either going to be able to carry a few more cattle, or you're going to be able to cut a little bit extra hay, whichever one you want to do, but you're going to end up with better yield off of it. So the first thing is just think about trying to divide a pasture. The second thing that you really have to pay attention to on this is your animal movement does not need to be based on the day of the week. It's based strictly on forage height. Okay, because if you think back about that curve, the whole idea is that you don't overgraze your pastures, and so you put the animals on before the forage gets too big, but you take them off before it gets grazed down too low. Because what you really have to keep in mind here is when you start talking about your grazing management plan, it is not an animal rotation schedule. Okay, what it is, it's a forage management tool, because you're trying to keep from undergrazing, but you're also trying to keep from overgrazing too much on that. And so kind of the guidelines that we have is it's how you manage it. It's going to depend on which forage species you have. For the most part, if you're talking about kind of our short grasses, fescue, orchard grass, Bermuda grass, those kind of things, you generally want to graze those down to about 3 to 4 inches and then get the animals off. And the reason for that is you are trying to maintain a little bit of residual leaf area after you graze, so that the plants can still capture some sunlight to be able to photosynthesize, and that way they don't have to depend on all their stored carbohydrates to be able to regrow. If we're talking about some of our kind of our taller grasses, so that's going to be things like sorghum Sudan grass, Ludex, maybe some of the native grasses, pearl millet, some of those kind of things, we need to leave a little bit more of a stubble with those. So usually we'll want to leave at least 8 inches of stubble on those, because that way if you graze just down to 8 inches, you still have a little bit of residual leaf area. So that's kind of the guides that we have as far as when you want to stop grazing these things. Another key thing to do here is you're going to need to use multiple forage species. I mean, it's not that you have to, but anytime you start adding more forages to your program and you diversify your forage base, what's going to happen is it's going to make your grazing management plan a lot more resilient. And it really comes down to the growth curve of tall fescue. We've all seen this. Tall fescue grows extremely well during that springtime. Then when we start getting into the, mid to late June, kind of July, August period, it's getting hotter, it's getting drier, so the fescue slumps. And then we get into September, October, it rains, temperatures cool down, so the fescue grows again, and we get this cycle. And so if the only forage species that you use on your farm is going to be tall fescue, you're going to run through this series of cycles where during the springtime, you're probably going to undergraze. You're going to have more forage and you know what to do with, but then you're going to get during the summertime, you're going to have less forage and you know what to do with. So spring, you have an abundance, summer, you have a lack. And it's just this constant cycle that you get. And then if the drought gets bad enough during the summertime, you're going to overgraze your pastures to the point that you're going to kill some of your plants. So the pastures aren't going to regrow very well in the fall because they've been stressed all summer, and your root growth is not doing very well. And then it's going to end up that what ends up happening is that somebody circled my Jason thing there. Okay, so what we want to try to do here is we want to try to make sure that we have a warm season grass is one of the best things that you can add. And hey, Reinhardt, did you do that?
Yes, I did.
Okay, here's the joke. Go back and do that again. As long as we got everybody here.
All right.
As long as we do that. Everybody know, our good friend that was the nutritionist here, he ruined my slide. Y'all see me use this slide forever. And I never realized till he got here that July, August, September, October, November spells doggone Jason. And so now this is known, it's not known as the Bates curve anymore. It's known as the doggone Jason curve. So he's ruined my curve. So we had to run him off to Texas A&M because we don't like him doing that.
That's right.
Okay. And I guess we probably recorded this, so hopefully Jason won't see that. But anyway, the goal that we have here, okay, is we use this cool season forage, but we supplement it with a warm season forage. So maybe, it's something that's going to help us more during the summertime. The reason we try to do this, okay, is because, fescue grows the best when your temperature is in the kind of the 60s to the low to mid 70s. That's when fescue does the best. When you start getting into those temperatures where in your upper 70s, 80s, and the low 90s, physiologically, fescue is not very adapted to that. And so that's why fescue doesn't grow well during the summertime. I take my warm season grasses, Bermuda grass, crabgrass, sorghum Sudan grass, those kind of things. They have an additional photosynthetic pathway going on with them that runs the best when the temperature is in the 80s to the low 90s. And so what ends up happening there, okay, is that when it gets hot, those plants are growing better. And also physiologically, they're much more efficient with their water use. So it doesn't take near as much water to grow a ton of Bermuda grass compared to what it takes to grow a ton of tall fescue. So if we can utilize the differences in the production seasons between these two different types of or these classifications of forages, so we can graze our cool season grasses during the spring and the fall. During the summertime, we can rest our fescue, use a warm season grass, get better production off of that, off of an acre of warm season grass during the summer, as well as resting the cool season grass. So there's a host of different forage species that we have, okay, that we have the opportunity to be able to use. And quite honestly, we could come back on a whole nother session and spend another, hour or so talking about every one of these species and the pros and the cons of each one of them. And so I'm not specifically saying that, there's one of these that are better than the other. That's not the point here. The point that I want to make is that you need to choose something off this list so that you have something that you can graze during that summertime so that you won't overgraze your cool season pastures, because use the complementary nature of these to boost your forage production. And so really kind of the goal that you're going to have is, okay, and we're thinking about it maybe not specifically on an individual pasture basis. We want to think about this on an entire farm basis. So you want to have some of your farm where you're really devoted to your cool season production. So you get really good production during that, March, April, May, kind of early June period. And then you also get that production in the fall. We can take some of that fall production of tall fescue, save it so we can stockpile to graze on into the November, kind of December period. But I also might want to have an area where I have it planted to some sort of a warm season forage, whether it be, Sudex or native grasses or Bermuda, all the different options we have. But what that's going to let you do is be able to graze that during that late June, July, August. So when the fescue starts to slump, you can get off of that, move on and graze the warm season grass and let that fescue be able to rest and be able to regrow. And then when you get into the September, October period, when the warm season grass is starting to play out, you flip them back onto that cool season forage. And here's the thing to understand. It makes perfect sense why adding a warm season forage improves your warm season forage production. That makes perfect sense. A lot of times what we don't realize is if you can add a warm season forage to your forage program, not only does it help you during the summertime, it also helps you improve your fall yield. And the reason is because if you haven't grazed that fescue all summer and grazed it into the ground and stressed it, when you actually get water and it starts to cool off, the fescue is going to grow faster. So you're going to actually get more cool season yield, more fall yield, if you're able to rest that fescue. So it helps us. And then, depending on the warm season species that you choose, then you might have the chance to be able to drill some sort of a cool season annual in there. So you might be able to drill some wheat into that. And then you might get a little bit of, maybe a little bit of December grazing, but you're definitely going to start getting some of that spring grazing. So if you choose something like wheat, a lot of times wheat is ready to graze often before the fescue is. So now all of a sudden I have something to graze even before the fescue. And so I've taken a system right here and just by adding a couple of new forage species to my fescue system, I've begun to kind of level out my forage curve. So instead of having these kind of peaks and valleys, I end up with a relatively steady kind of forage production, and it makes it much easier in terms of my grazing management to be able to handle this. Okay, so in terms of your steps for rotational grazing, I guess the thing is just start somewhere. We're not, going to expect somebody to just completely revolutionize, tear out all their fences and build all new ones. And, it's nothing like that. Just start somewhere. It may be just as simple as going out and stringing a temporary electrified fence, just simply cutting a field in half. That's a place to be able to start. So start somewhere to try to give yourself control over that forage curve so you can let plants be able to have a little bit of a rest. Make sure you're paying attention to your forage height. Try not to graze it down below, if it's fescue and orchard grass, that kind of thing, down below about 3 to 4 inches. Make sure you're leaving enough leaf area so that when you get the cattle off, that plant can jump back very quick and be able to grow. As far as how many paddocks you need and how big they should be, that's going to be completely dependent on your goals, okay? Some people may decide, I want to move so far into this and have such good control over that curve. I want to base my paddock sizes so that, I move every 2 days. Or maybe I want to do it every day. There's some people that want to do it like that. Well, then what you do is you build fences and make your pasture small enough so there's enough forage for, 1 day or 2 days or whatever. Some people may say, okay, that's a little too intense. Maybe you want to set it up so it's once a week. So you move them on, Saturday or Sunday, something like that. Okay, then you just adjust the size of your paddocks. If somebody decides, I don't want to have to do it, but maybe move once every couple of weeks. Okay, you just adjust your paddock size. Make sure you understand that the smaller your paddocks are, the more control you have over the grazing management. But there's nothing that says you have to be the most intensive operation, in the world. Just do what fits the goals that you have. The next thing, and you knew you weren't going to get out of a forage presentation without me stressing the need for clovers. You've got to put clovers in every grass pasture that you have. This is a key component of it. You get all sorts of benefits. You get that improved forage quality because you're adding, a forage that has more protein and more energy in it. So the animals are going to do better. It's going to decrease your nitrogen need. So if I have a good stand of, clovers out there, there's been tons of research that showed you won't need any spring nitrogen. So that might save you 45, 60, maybe 70 pounds of nitrogen right there. Cut your costs, you get better quality forage cheaper. So that's another reason to do it. It can also decrease the impact of this endophyte that we have in Kentucky 31. So it's going to decrease fescue toxicosis. The animals are going to rebreed better. The calves are going to gain, wean off better if you do that. So it's extremely important to add clovers. Here we're at 2 pounds of white, 4 pounds of red, and we want to overseed that, broadcast that in the last 2 weeks of February. So make sure that this becomes part of your routine grazing management program, and that you're making sure you're adding clovers to every acre that you've got. And so this is really the thing that I want to try to leave y'all with. Okay, just think about adding some fences somewhere to decrease, the size of the pastures, so that you have a chance to rest some of your fields while other ones are getting grazed, so they can regrow better. But pay attention to your grazing height. You really want to make sure you're not grazing down below 3 or 4 inches. And there's lots of different ways to be able to do it. But you need to also be thinking about, do you need warm season forage? There may be some on this webinar that, you have enough, Dallas grass, common Bermuda grass, Johnson grass, that maybe you don't need to add any warm season forages. Okay. There may be some of y'all that don't have enough of that. So you may decide, I've got this field of fescue that's not in very good shape. It's pretty thin stand. Maybe next year I need to plant, some sorghum Sudan grass on that and get me some grazing off of that. That's a way to be able to do that. And then the last thing I want to leave with you is just kind of be flexible. You may decide the first, time you do this, okay, I put a temporary fence, in this spot, and that didn't really work as well as what I'd like. It would have been better if I would have run it a different way or in a different area. Or maybe, you decided, I did one temporary fence, next year I probably would have been better off if I'd have put 2. But be flexible with it so that, you can change. That's the reason when you get ready to start trying to split pastures up, you really don't want to do it with permanent fencing. You want to try to do it as much as you can with electric temporary fencing, so that if you decide it doesn't work well, you can always pick it up and move it and put it in another spot. And so that's really kind of the points that we want to make. So with that, I think it's time for us to have question number 2.
We can get it pulled up here. Okay, you should see question 2 now on your screen. And this question is, due to this meeting, are you going to develop or improve your grazing management plan? And then if yes, when will you implement that plan?
So Courtney, I'm assuming that they know that if they really say I'm not planning to, we're not tracking them. So this is completely anonymous. So we're not going to come beating up. Bates is not going to drive to your house tonight and try to put you in a headlock. But we really want to know this.
I'll give it about 10 more seconds. So if you haven't answered, you got about 10 more seconds.
While y'all are waiting on those to come in, I'll just tell everybody I got a ton of questions over here, and I just kind of let them roll as you were wrapping up, Gary. So I'll try to ask those to you, wrap them up and ask them to you live, and just want to let everybody know I'm not still typing into the Q&A box.
I just shared the results with you, Doc.
Okay. So a large percentage are going to be doing it sometime within the next year. Okay, so that's good. So yeah, I mean, that's interesting. Thanks for replying to that. Okay, so next, I think we have question 3.
Oh, my bad. Hold on. Okay. Question 3 is, on how many acres will you implement or improve your grazing management plan? Got a few different ranges here you can choose from.
This one you're supposed to tell a joke, Gary.
Well, we're actually going to have question 4. Question 4 is who do you appreciate more, me or Reinhardt?
Oh, it would break the system. It'd be so lopsided.
I'm thinking it would too.
Yeah, why am I not a choice though?
It wouldn't be fair.
Okay, I'm going to share results with you.
Okay. Yeah, 0 to 50. So, there's, again, so, I mean, we're talking about over 50% is in kind of the, somewhere between a 0 and 100, which is not, it's not surprising really when you think about kind of the, what we have for cow-calf producers across the state. So, okay, so, I mean, that's where we're at. And so that's all I've got. I think we're going to, Justin, we will open it up for questions now. And are you just going to holler out questions to me and we'll go from there?
I am. I'm going to read some to you. First couple you might be able to just rapid fire answer. So stocking ratio, cow or cow-calf pair per acre.
Okay, so what would we normally expect in terms of a stocking rate with cow-calf pairs? Okay, so the thing that we normally say is that you're going to need about 2 acres per cow-calf pair. A lot of times that's, if you can have a significant impact on that number based on what you do for management, for fertility, for your grazing management, as well as what you do from a hay standpoint. Do you produce your own hay versus do you buy your hay and bring it into the farm? But normally what we think of is you're going to at least start with about 2 acres per cow-calf pair. And then as you improve your management, you might be able to decrease the amount of acreage that you need per pair.
Okay. So let's see. Kind of go back over just a real quick recap the clover, the rate, seeding rate, and how to best get it established. Do you need frost?
Okay. Yeah. So what we recommend is 2 pounds of white clover per acre, 4 pounds of red clover per acre. Mix those together. Come in those last 2 weeks of February and broadcast that, because by that point, the pastures are going to be grazed down pretty low because they've not been trying to, regrow during the wintertime. So they're just going to be sitting there. Ground's probably going to be a little bit muddy, pretty wet, maybe even be getting another snow on top of it. Broadcast it and you can get a stand. So 2 pounds of white, 4 pounds of red.
Okay, good deal. Hey, you might want to stop your screen share just so we can see talking heads on here.
Okay.
I'm going to the next. A lot of questions about, I guess, creating different options for warm season and cool season grazing. A lot of the questions were, can I overseed, or can I kind of manage fescue and warm season natives in one pasture? And crabgrass, same question.
Right.
Ryegrass and Bermuda grass, the whole deal. Yeah, I don't know how to best recap that, but I just thought.
Okay, no, so I recognize kind of what the question is, because what I kind of presented was you got your acre of fescue and you got your acreage of the warm season grasses and you're managing them completely separate. That's the easiest way to do it. If you get ready to start trying to have a mixture of a cool and a warm season grass, the success of that depends on primarily 2 different things. Number one, you got to choose the right species to try to mix. You're not going to be successful if you try to mix, fescue with a tall growing grass like sorghum Sudan grass, because the sorghum Sudan grass gets tall, it's going to shake the fescue out, and it's just not going to work. So you need to mix species that are about kind of the same height in terms of growing, just so they can be able to get light. So what that means is, you can use fescue and Bermuda grass or fescue and crabgrass together. Now, the second thing that really influences that is your grazing management, okay? Because routinely what ends up happening, and some of y'all out here have this exact, experience. You'll have a field of tall fescue that has these patches of common Bermuda grass in it. And the thing that, people always think of is, well, my cattle won't eat Bermuda grass. And the reason is because when you put them into a big pasture, they would rather have that cool season grass. So they're going to go after it. They're going to graze it because they're not forced to eat their Bermuda grass. And then by the time the fescue ends up getting overgrazed and it's not growing much, that Bermuda grass is so stemmy, it's just unpalatable. And then the animals avoid it. So if you're going to try to have a cool and a warm season mixture, you have to have a rotational grazing, a grazing management plan, so that you force the animals to eat everything, and then you get off of it and you let it regrow, so the animals can't select the fescue, graze it out, and leave the Bermuda grass. A piece of data that I did not show you from that Carl Hovland study with the cow-calf pairs where they used rotational grazing and continuous on Bermuda fescue pastures. I was there in Georgia working my PhD when that study was going on, so I had a chance to watch that. And what ended up happening is on the continuous grazing over the course of 3 years, the animals basically grazed all of the fescue out so that it looked like a pure Bermuda grass pasture. The rotational grazing, they maintained a perfect mixture. So if you went out there in July, it looked like 100% Bermuda grass. If you went out there in April, it looked like 100% standard fescue. So you can have that mixture, but it takes really good management to be able to keep them. If you're going to try to do that, and you want to try to plan that, you have to have good rotational grazing. It's much easier to plant your Bermuda grass first and then drill your fescue into it. If you have fescue and then you try to drill Bermuda grass into it, that's not going to work because Bermuda grass is very sensitive to shading and it just won't work. So plant Bermuda grass, then go with your fescue. We've been trying to do some research. Dr. Renata Nave, my forage researcher here at UT, my counterpart, she's been trying to get some studies going where we take fescue and overseed it with crabgrass. We haven't been able to get those started. I think that's going to work. And I think if you want to try to do that, you can overseed that into fescue, but you're going to need to come in the springtime and graze that fescue down, get the stubble down, and then overseed it with crabgrass. I think that can work.
Good deal. I've got a kind of a one-shot question here. I'm going to go ahead and ask because I bet you a lot of people are thinking it when you showed the one slide that said Johnson grass on it. I had a one over here in the Q&A. It just said Johnson grass ? Exclamation point.
Yeah, Johnson grass is just a warm season forage. Okay, I mean technically I know it's listed as a noxious weed in the state of Tennessee, but that doesn't mean that we can't grow it. Okay, what it means is that if you're selling seed, it can't have any Johnson grass seed in it, but it's a great warm season forage. It's not perfect. It's got some issues. It can have some nitrate issues. It can have some prussic acid in the fall, but all it is a perennial sorghum sudan grass is all it is. If you've got a field that has a lot of Johnson grass in it, yeah, I mean, why not go ahead and utilize it? It creates issues with fescue and hay production stuff. I recognize that, but it's got its place where it fits.
Yeah, if growing up some years, if we didn't have that, we'd have been in a mess.
Oh, that's right. There's a lot of years. If it wasn't for Johnson grass and crabgrass and Dallas grass, man, Tennessee would have been hurting.
Yeah, no doubt. So I literally have 41 unanswered questions in the Q&A box right now. No way we're going to be able to get to all those, but we'll be able to save those. That'd be good fodder for articles and extension posts down the road. Might be some good ideas in there, but I will. We're getting a little bit over time, I think. Actually, we're doing pretty decent, aren't we, on time? So,
yeah, I thought so.
Yeah, we're good.
You're doing good. I think usually till 7, right?
Yeah, we don't have to do that, but let's keep going. I was thinking that we were getting close on time, but had some questions in here, about managing fencing on setting up a rotational grazing scheme and water. There was some reference to to Greg Judy, the notorious YouTube grazer. No, I shouldn't say notorious, famous YouTube grazer. Not using a back fence, just kind of forward grazing, I guess, if you want to call it that, or whatever the term is for it. If you want to just talk a little bit more about, managing fencing, polywire, trying to manage around limited water sources, shade, just kind of.
Okay. look, there's a lot of different approaches to doing this, okay? And like specifically the issue about like not using a back fence. You know, what's going to happen is once your cattle get used to this system, okay, in rotational grazing, what's going to happen is when you move the fence and it, you know, it's into the fresh grass, the new growth, that's where they're going to be. They're not going to go back because all that's been grazed. They're going to stay to the new stuff. So it has the chance to be able to work. I would not start with that because the cattle have to get kind of trained, you know, kind of to that system. But it's something that can work. I would say before you decided to go that way, a better way to be able to do it would be able to kind of just use electric fencing to limit them, and then, you know, move them to a new one with fencing. But once the cattle get trained to it, you could be able to do that. It also works much better in the fall on, say, tall fescue than it maybe does in the spring. You know, because in the spring, the fescue is constantly trying to regrow, and they will kind of tend to go back and graze some of that. In the fall, you know, when we get into the kind of the November period and we get enough frosts where it's kind of shutting the fescue down, you know, you put that front fence and they'll graze it and they'll graze up to it. But once you move that front fence, they've grazed everything behind them and the fescue's not trying to regrow, so you don't really need a back fence. So I don't know if I've necessarily answered that question. There's no particular right or wrong way, as long as you control where the cattle are and you make sure that you let some of your pastures rest and regrow. So it's much easier to do that if you use fencing to control exactly where they are. And, you know, taking the back fence out can work. It works well for some people, but you better get your cattle trained for that.
You remember the great John D. Smalling. I worked for him whenever I was in school there in Knoxville, and he did creep grazing, and he did it really effectively. And, you know, just kind of a forward creep deal, let the calves go under the electric fence and get the really good stuff, and then turn the cows in after that. I always thought that worked pretty well.
Oh yeah, there's any number of ways you can make adjustments on this. You know, if some, you know, so you could do kind of that forward creep where the calves can go under the fence. They pick, cows come in there. Another place where you can try to do this thing, if somebody decides that they want to try to, maybe they're trying to grass feed, you know, some animals for freezer beef or to sell quarters, or, you know, maybe just to sell individual cuts or whatever, you can use a forward grazing where you take those animals you're trying to grow, let them go out into the pasture first, you know, graze the top highest quality stuff, then you move them and follow them with the cows, because cows don't need as, you know, high of a nutritional level as what those growing calves do. So you could use kind of a forward grazing and do it like that. There's any number of ways to make this work.
That kind of brings up a question that was on here early in a follow-up to Tuesday's webinar with Dr. Loveday and Greg Upchurch. They were talking about forage finishing, and I think the comment was that Dr. Loveday had mentioned that, you know, finishing on fescue sometimes can affect the taste and tenderness. I think you mentioned more it was from age than anything else. But, you know, I think it's more the maturity and the nutritional value of the forage, right, than it is the actual fescue.
Yes, that's really what it is. And a lot of this kind of comes down to kind of the endophyte issue. You know, with if you're grazing Kentucky 31, you're trying to grow animals to finish. They're not going to gain as well because of that fescue toxicosis. So it's going to take them longer to get to your target weight, whatever that is, 1,000, 1,100, whatever you're shooting for. And so it's going to take them longer. So they're going to get a little older and that kind of thing. So if you are trying to do some sort of forage finishing, you want to really use species other than Kentucky 31 fescue. But now your grazing management, you think about this, because think about that data that I showed you from that Louisiana study where they continuous and rotational grazing. Actually, the highest average daily gain was with the continuous grazing, and it was because the animals had selectivity. So if you do have a group of animals that you're trying to forage finish, think about your grazing management plan. Don't treat them the way you do cows. There, you do want them to be more selective. Don't force them to graze every bit of it. You want them grazing that top highest nutritional forage, and then find the lower producing animals, the cows or whatever, let them come in and clean that up. So your grazing management is, you can adjust it to fit that system.
Yeah, good stuff. And actually that parlays us into another good discussion on a question that came up here about stockpiling fescue. So on the other end of the growing and highly nutritious, can you and you might have addressed some of this in the discussion. I was paying attention to the questions here, but just talk about stockpiling fescue.
You mean you weren't paying attention and hanging on my every word during my presentation, Reinhardt?
No.
Exactly. Okay.
Yes.
So stockpiling fescue is one of the best recommendations that we have. Okay, because the great thing about tall fescue is that you're going to get all that fall growth, but even after it frosts and gets snows on, the quality of that fescue does not degrade really very fast during the fall. So we can take advantage of that. Grow as much of that fescue as you can during September and October, and maybe set some of it aside and wait to graze it during November, December, and that kind of thing. And actually, that's one of the reasons we recommend fertilizing fescue in the fall, particularly if you get a fall where we get good moisture. You know, if you apply 30 to 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre of that fescue and promote as much fall growth as you can, it will decrease your hay feeding, period, by anywhere between 30 and 60 days. So, Reinhardt, it's interesting. So a friend of mine, one of my counterparts in another state, did a survey, and he surveyed the people in Wisconsin, okay, the average cow-calf producer. They average feeding hay 120 days a year. The average producer in Tennessee, in the Mid-South area, when he surveyed, they average feeding hay 120 days a year. The average producer in Mississippi feeds hay 120 days a year. And there is no reason why we in Tennessee should have to feed hay as many days as somebody in Wisconsin does when we can stockpile fescue. So we need to take advantage of the forage species and the weather we have and stockpile as much fescue as we can.
Yeah, that's good stuff. And I'm kind of letting your answers lead me to the next question. So you talked about when we do have to feed hay. Have a few questions here on, on that process, whether it be unrolling, moving around in hay rings, just maybe a little bit of information on the best approach to hay feeding when we have to do it.
Yeah, man, I hate those questions because those are hard. Figuring out the best way to feed hay is really hard, okay, because the same system, two different people could do the exact same system, and it could be a success for one, it could be a failure for the other one. Okay, what you got to think about is, number one, you got to decrease hay waste because the animals, reject it or it spoils or that kind of stuff. So unrolling can work, okay, but you are not going to unroll a week's worth of hay and let that be efficient. You have to unroll enough for them to eat basically in a day. Otherwise, it's going to become, bedding and that kind of thing. So unrolling can work if you do it consistently. We've always talked about feeding, in hay rings because we try to get that to, decrease the waste, and particularly with the cone feeders and all, it kind of does decrease waste. Boy, you're going to make a big old mess around the outside of it. And man, there's nothing worse than having to try to get a tractor through that big old tall muddy mess. And yeah, that's just, you hate it. And then you end up with a spot where all the pigweed is going to grow in the springtime. So, if you're going to try to do it like that, creating some sort of heavy use area so that you don't get the mud and everything, that's something that can work. There's been this recent idea of, I've just lost the terminology, bale grazing,
yeah.
Where you set your bales out and you use your fencing so that they don't have access to all the bales. It's just, okay, you move the fence, now they have access to a new bale. That can work, okay, but you're going to probably need to make sure you cover that bale with some sort of a bonnet, because we lose a huge amount of waste or a huge amount of hay due to rainfall and water wicking up from the bottom. So that's not perfect. You will have some hay loss with that. So there's not a perfect way. I know some of the stuff that has been done out the Heifer Development Center. We have done the inline or the fence line feeding, where you build the hay feeder, half the hay ring into the fence, so that it doesn't really help the mud part on the cattle side, maybe as much, is still going to cause some problems there, but it definitely makes it easier for you to get in with the tractor. So that's another thing to be able to think of. So there's a lot of different ways, and all of them can be successful, and all of them can be a disaster. You're just trying to waste as little hay as possible.
Yeah, I think the principal is Matt Webb. Of course, you know that the county agent there in Marshall County, where the Heifer Development Center is, he's done a lot of that work with the inline hay feeders, and has done a good job of looking at different styles. And now that we talk about that, I believe he has a hay feeding kind of virtual field day coming up soon. I don't know the date off the top of my head, but if everybody on here will go to the UT Beef and Forage Center Facebook page, if you don't follow that already, if you just go on Facebook, if you're on there, and go to UT Beef and Forage Center and follow that and like it and scroll through the posts. I saw a post on that, I think yesterday. So. Okay.
Yeah. Dave does a good job on that. Yep.
Yep. Definitely. See, I'm trying to think. A lot of these things that you've covered pretty handily. Do you want to talk any specifics on varieties? Not varieties, but species. So if you're talking warm season natives, is there anything specific you'd like to say about that? Maybe not natives, but crabgrass. I did. Now that I mentioned this, I had a question on, what's been your experience with crabgrass and varieties? Just different experiences there.
Well, first of all, I will compliment you on knowing the difference between a forage variety and a forage species. So that's pretty good for an animal scientist.
Thanks.
Okay. So, like, specifically about crabgrass. Okay, let's talk a little bit about that. So, it has a real place in our forage production systems, the crabgrass. The more I see of it, the more I hear about it, I think it has a really good place, because it's an annual, so you either have to plant it every year, you have to manage it to try to let it reseed, but it's relatively easy to plant, and the seeding rate is relatively low. You're just looking at 4 to 6 pounds to the acre, and it can be pretty high quality forage, and it's just so quick to establish that it solves a lot of establishment kind of issues. So I think it's something that can work. There's a lot more varieties out there now than there were probably a decade ago. If we go back a decade or maybe slightly more, about the only variety you had was Red River crabgrass. And then, another variety came out of that program called Quick and Big. And now there's a couple of other varieties. I can't think of any of the names, because most of the time I see them as experimentals and I see the numbers. But coming out of Noble Foundation out of Oklahoma is where a lot of this comes from. So there's the chance to be able to use those. A lot of times, we do warm season annual variety trials where we will look at Sudex or maybe some pearl millets, crabgrasses, maybe even some teff grasses. So you can see how some of these different varieties yield over some different locations, some different yields. So we have all of that information on the website utbeef.com under variety testing. And so I think again, I'm not going to say that crabgrass is for everybody, but with as easy as it is to plant and as productive as it is, it's something that it wouldn't be hard for somebody just to try a little bit, because some of these varieties are really improved in terms of their yield, and they give you a lot more yield than just kind of what we would think of as just our common old crabgrass.
And maybe, just to dip the toe in the water and start, using it to repair some hay feeding areas. Would you suggest that?
Yes. So if I had that hay feeding area, I see where you're going with this question now. Thanks for leading me there, Justin. So if you have these hay feeding areas where, they've been trumped up during that winter time, and if you don't do anything with them, man, spiny pigweed's going to eat your lunch. You're not really going to be successful after hay season to come in and plant fescue, because that's going to be March to early April. Fescue's not going to get established. So if you were to come in there, shape it up with a disc or harrow or something, and then come in mid-April, late April, maybe early May, and overseed it with some crabgrass, it'll get established. It'll give you some grazing, and it's relatively cheap way. I'm not going to say it's going to eliminate spiny pigweed, but it will hold. You won't have near as much if you get that ground cover and have some competition for it. Yeah, that's a really good idea to do that.
And even have a little grazing in those areas, and
right.
I think what little I follow of it, I've seen some people start that way and really see how productive it is just in those repair areas. In the middle of that summer slump for fescue,
Right.
and then they really just start expanding their use of it. I've seen Kevin Thompson here at the research station where my office is. He uses it in some of his dairy grazing paddocks, so the exercise paddocks and grazing as well. And he has been able to establish basically a perennial rotation of, I think he uses cereal rye, but the perennial component being the crabgrass. And it just like you said earlier, it might not work for everybody, but he's been able to do that for several years without replanting the crabgrass.
Yeah, because if you come in that late summertime, that late July, early August, and kind of lighten up on your grazing so those plants can produce plenty of seed, it will reseed itself, no doubt.
So the last question I'm going to ask you is something that I know nothing about, which is not hard to say about me in forages, but orchard grass. I know you work a lot with orchard grass, and there's actually a question on here about Timothy, and I just don't ever hear anything about Timothy anymore. It seems like when I was a kid, I would hear more about it, and it's been a long time since I've heard folks talk much about Timothy. So just, what about where are we with orchard grass and the persistence of it, and maybe even some Timothy?
Okay, well, let's talk about the Timothy first, because that's the easier one to deal with. So what we end up with, we are pushing the southern edge of where cool season grasses are adapted. And we can plant Timothy, and Timothy is going to look really good the first year. I mean, it's going to look, you plant it in the fall, that springtime is going to look like $1,000,000. But what's going to happen is after you cut it, it goes through one summer, and, depending on where you are in the state and how much rainfall you get, you're probably going to end up being left with about 25 to maybe 50% of a stand left. Even under hay, the best conditions, it's not going to last very long. Now maybe if we're up in upper East Tennessee and we have a good rainfall summer, you might get it to last 2 years, but that's about it. Most places it lasts 1 year. So the only place we normally recommend for people to plant Timothy are if they're specifically in the horse hay market and there's a marketing advantage to having Timothy in there. But if it's just purely agronomic, yield, persistence, we're worried about Timothy, it's probably not the best way to go. Now, orchard grass is one that, again, our stands of orchard grass don't last as long usually as our fescue stands, but orchard grass is more adapted than Timothy. I would say that is going to be the one that's, if you want to try to avoid the endophyte, orchard grass would be one of the ways to go. It makes a much better hay crop than it does grazing because you lose it faster in a pasture. But it is one that, can work in our system. So I'd say this, don't use Timothy, but you can use orchard grass. But you got to make sure you manage it. Watch that either mowing height if you're mowing it for hay, or that grazing height if you're grazing, because if you mow or graze too low, you're going to thin that stand out quick.
And there's been some genetic selection work going on, right, on trying to find some varieties of both of those that persist longer, or is that a thing?
So yes, originally coming out of UT back quite a few years ago, Persist Orchard Grass came out of the plant breeding program with Dr. Bob Conger. And it was selected to have better grazing. So what Dave McIntosh and I have done is everybody retired. Nothing was getting done with those genetics. So we planted some of the original orchard grass seed in a small little paddock, probably not more than 1/10 of an acre, and grazed the snot out of it with sheep. I mean, we literally tried to kill it. And so we killed probably 90+% of the plants, and then the plants that survived, we dug them up and put them into a space planting, and then looked at disease resistance. We looked at maturity, which ones produced, matured later. We looked at vigor, various kind of things, selected out of that, then started selecting for yield and all this. Our idea is that we're going to have a new variety of orchard grass coming out, a new variety of Persist. We've done some tests with it. It's looked really good. Right now, It is with a seed company in Oregon, and we're going still through the process of trying to get that variety developed. That variety, probably the seed, it's going to be, I would expect at least 2 years before any seed is available. And what I have learned is I'm glad I didn't choose to be a plant breeder for a career, because we've been working on this thing for about 10 years and we still hadn't got that stinking thing out yet. But eventually we hope to have a variety of orchard grass. If you look at the data that we have, it's one of the highest yielding ones that are out there right now, and it should have better persistence. And we're hoping this, well, actually, yeah, we're trying to get a study going right now with this orchard grass in there to see how well it persists.
Yeah. But
So
that,
anyway, so
it has the makings for being something, because that seems like, talking to Vance Watson back when I was at Mississippi State and all those guys that have found something that hit, that was a real famous variety. I always had some backstory behind it, and it was like an accident, or like you said, found it.
Well, we wanted to name this thing Bates's Best, but they shot that one down. I couldn't.
Cooler heads prevailed.
Yeah.
Thank goodness. You'd have been hard to handle that way. All right, so we're actually right at 7, Doc. It's like 7:01. Perfect. I mean, we hit it just perfect. I think covered a lot of good information on rotational grazing. Even got to talk about some species stuff. I know I learned a lot, and I'm seeing a lot of positive comments here in the chat and a bunch more questions. I'll just say again to everybody watching at home or in groups, wherever you are, if you didn't get your question answered, your county agent's there for you. We're here for you. We'll follow up. And I think I saw where Courtney had written in the chat here that she'll send out some links to what we talked about, utbeef.com and UT Beef and Forage Center Facebook page. So we'll just load that email that you get after this up with all those goodies that you can link to and keep finding this good information that Dr. Bates and Dave and his folks put out. So you have anything else to say before we sign off here, Doc?
No, man, look, just thank everybody that's on this. Thank y'all so much for your support of all, the university and our Beef and Forage programs. Y'all have no idea how much we appreciate that. We feel the support that y'all give us. Yep.
Amen to that. And I'll say I appreciate it too. And thank you, Dr. Bates, for being on here. Appreciate you, Gary.
All right. Thank you, brother.
Courtney, do you have anything we need to say before we get off here?
I think we're good.
All right. So the next one is next week, correct? Yeah, I shouldn't have said that. We'll edit that part. This is always the most awkward part, trying to end it, so let's just shut her off. Thanks, guys.
All right, bye. Thanks, Dr. Bates.
Thank y'all.